What I hope to talk about is how a good plan can work for Platte River Power Authority and the member communities in seeking to move towards 100% carbon-free energy. I mentioned that I was at the Department of Energy, and this thing that Platte River is going through called an Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, is something that we actually worked to get into an act of Congress in 1992. We've been running this electric utility industry in this country in pretty much the same model for about 120 years. We're actually beginning to talk about a world in which we can electrify everything with clean, renewable energy and maintain that reliability and economic security that we value. There's probably a Yogi Berra quote in here somewhere that says, planning is hard, especially for the future. Planners are managers. Utility folks manage the utility on behalf of the shareholders, in your case, the communities that make up the Platte River Power Authority and invest their hard-earned money through rates and other investment. The utility's first priority then is to translate the policy given to them by policymakers into planning priorities. So the first thing you should ask when you look at what PRPA or any other utility says it's doing is, are they doing what the policymakers said they should be doing? Good planners build feedback loops and stepwise processes with feedback checks. You have to forecast the future. It's a guess. It's better than a crystal ball. But it shouldn't just be an extrapolation using the formula for the curve of the historical line. You have to look out at what's going on in your community that you serve as a utility and make a reasonable estimate about where this is going. One is you have to look at the options. So in a simple sense, on the one hand, you've got what do we need? And on the other hand, you've got how can we meet the need? And a plan tries to match those up. Importantly, the plan also increasingly should be integrated, meaning instead of just coming up with a perfect match, what you're trying to do is actually integrate your solutions with an internalization of the policy targets of the policy leaders. To do that, we use models. Been a lot of talk about models around COVID. They are indispensable. They're the only thing we have for putting together scenarios and stories about the future. U.S. Department of Energy gives us this chart, which says you start with your forecast, as I said, you go through scenario identification, you insert your cost assumptions. There's a lot of mischief done in cost assumptions. There's a lot of well-intentioned behavior as well. And what if the cost of gas is much higher? What if the cost of solar keeps falling and falls faster? What if we have a climate emergency and a climate carbon tax is passed in Congress? That's the textbook version. I'm sure it was designed by an engineer, but all you engineers out there, thank you for your good work. But it's pretty linear and it's not exactly reality. Reality says that in each stage of this process, every time you get a run, you get an output, you get a report, somebody's going to look at it and say, I need to go back a few steps. When people come out with the portfolio costs like PRPA has for its 4 portfolios, some of those numbers strike some people as being just fine. For others, they seem a little out of the scope of reality and deserve some closer attention. What that is people asking for those feedback loops. And planners know this. They know they're going to take that feedback and they're going to look hard at their initial assumptions if they're doing this right and see if some adjustments are warranted. The best planning processes I've seen, however, open themselves up to feedback loops, open themselves up to stakeholders. It's an investment of time, yes, but it pays off in the end. So what has changed is really what's driving the need for better planning. The first is carbon. We have to figure out how to be carbon free. PRPA recognizes it. The communities that are served by PRPA recognize it. The board recognizes it. So it's a question of how. And it's actually what we can do is we can change demand just like we change the supply solutions that we use to meet the requirement for electricity service. We've begun to enjoy the experience of energy efficiency, demand response, better buildings, smarter grid controls, demand control, demand management is just as much a resource as building a power plant. In fact, it's a more affordable one, it's a more equitable one, and it pays bonus benefits like higher job numbers. It outperforms the supply side every time. We have more resources than we had before. So the combo of the solar is less expensive, dramatically less expensive than it was just even 5 years ago. But the combo of solar and storage is just breaking down barriers everywhere. And finally, the electricity sector has the potential to eliminate direct combustion entirely. I mentioned this earlier on, but we now have the technologies necessary to electrify transmission at all sizes, from semi-trucks down to the e-bikes that my wife and I now have in our garage here. We can run our lives on renewable energy increasingly, and there is reasonable demand that we do so. We still are doing most of our planning with old models that were developed for a very different kind of utility industry. We have models now that can handle big data. With this and with the whole thing, I started with huge respect for the task in front of these people. I want to point out some of the things, though, that opportunities, if you will, for improvement to make things better. So far, we know they're doing it because WAPA requires it. It's also just generally what utilities and power providers should do. So they will cover the years 21 through 25 with a action plan and then roll it out to 2040 in the IRP. That's a little issue of concern right at the very start. 20 years is not a long time for a plan, especially since resources like things like natural gas power plants can last 60 years. So if you install any kind of solar today, it's going to go out to 2045. That's 5 years of additional performance and potential benefits that should be reflected in the plan. And when it comes to the resources at PRPA, there's a lot of inertia in fossil fuels. PRPA is also substantially overbuilt. Right-sizing your resources to more carefully fit your load or to the load you need to fill in is a much more economical, financially and economically sustainable path to show up. Here's the 4 scenarios. I'm not going to go into them in great detail because later on I'm going to share with you some insights about good planning that draw on some of the, I'll say, potential weaknesses or flaws in the planning that I've seen in PRPA's plan so far. In planning for something out in 2030, it's best to keep some options open. And I'm a little concerned that the zero carbon plan is extreme because it doesn't. The PRPA has started to share some really interesting studies, but they're a little myopic. We know there are more jobs in energy efficiency than renewable energy. There are more jobs in renewable energy than in fossil energy. So you're likely to see increased spending power, take-home pay, in a cleaner, more distributed energy system. That has to be estimated as part of the economic impact of the planning effort. So there's an opportunity here to look more closely at those distributed resources and integrate them into the plannings. We used to draw a bright line between utility scale and distribution. It technologically doesn't make any sense anymore, for one thing, but here's a really important business proposition for you. If PRPA doesn't start thinking about how it can do a lot more in the distributed and distribution space in partner with its member communities, then it is a business in liquidation. The best and highest use of PRPA, it seems to me, would be as an integrated energy services provider, not just a utility scale supplier. So I also would say there's a bit of a lesson here to the board of PRPA and the municipal utilities that there's always an opportunity to improve communication. It's one of the hardest things about this business. Traditional models, as I've described, work on the left hand of the screen here and basically do all the utility scale resources and assume they all intersect with the transmission grid somewhere. Then somebody buys them. This is kind of a PRPA centric, if you will, view that ignores, of course, the fact that they're already doing help on things like DSM programs, but they generally don't model distribution scale. So the feedback loops are at the small scale and at the big scale. If you optimize the distributed energy resources out to the year 2050, the country could save $372 billion every year on electricity. It rises every year leading up to that and reaches that level in 2050 because distributed energy resources respond to climate change better than utility scale resources. If you pursue a 95% reduction in carbon for the entire United States out to 2050, you save even more, $417 billion. The first thing that the really best planning utilities do is they open data rooms. You also need to be really transparent about the model. Unfortunately, there's no reason why scenarios development has to be a wholly owned enterprise of the modeler or the utility. And that's a really, really good way to build public confidence in what you're doing as well. Letting stakeholders, treating them respectfully, and letting them be a big part of the process is a great way to get results that everybody's already pre-bought into. Well, as to the data, you need well-documented and reputable cost estimates. I mentioned the resource chunk size. Aurora 50 megawatts, Aegeus 100 megawatts, thousands of times more. You can't model distributed resources in chunks that big, as I already said. You got to be careful how you show your numbers. One of the things, and this is a PRPA thing, there's one place where they used a graph where they just showed nominal numbers. And nominal numbers stretching out 20 years look very different than real numbers, because real numbers are adjusted for discount rates or inflation. And the best way to compare numbers is to use real numbers, with consistent discount rates or inflation rates for all the resources you're considering. There's a lot of places where mischief can hide: least cost, reliability, resilience. Again, with stakeholders, when people ask a question, give a direct, honest, and complete answer. When you're modeling, as I already explained with the diagrams, you got to do the feedback loops. You got to let the results inform modifications to your assumptions, or else you're just hardening your opinion and you're missing the point. A real plan, starts laying the groundwork for the big changes that you expect to happen by your planning deadline. That, to me, those 8 principles in the resource diversification plan from the PRPA board are the agenda for what PRPA should be doing in its resource planning. How are they going to ensure there's better transmission? How are they going to ensure there's better integration with distributed resources? Those are the things I'd want to see in the final IRP. You got to integrate the results of the studies. You can't just go out there and get a stack of studies and put them on the table. You got to show how they're useful and how they inform the planning. And unfortunately, PRPA's study of storage did not assess all the ancillary benefits and other grid benefits that storage can provide. That's not a good way to look at a resource. Highly effective planning modeling, you got to show your work. You can't give yourself an out where you cheat on the policy when you're planning. You got to be consistent with your policy objectives throughout, so that you don't get tempted to do things that are sort of cheap and easy. You got to look at how things work out in terms of costs and benefits at all levels, and not just impose limits on resource options. You should challenge your elected officials and your hired officials at the utilities and at PRPA with your questions, because first of all, I think they really enjoy talking about what they're doing. They're really glad to have you interested. They will feel better knowing what your opinion is. You care, you're thankful, you're engaged,